So today we are going to study about the motor system, and in the motor system we will be understanding the descending tracts. As we have done earlier, we know that the sensory system is made up of the ascending tracts and the motor system is made of the descending tracts. The ascending tracts will take the information from the sensory organs to the brain, that is the sensory cortex, and the motor system translates the information from the motor cortex to the effector organs. Now, basically, we have two effector organs, the muscles and the glands. And the muscles here would include the skeletal muscles, which are voluntary, the smooth muscles basically forming the walls of internal organs, and the cardiac muscles, which are specialized muscles found in the wall of the heart. Glands would be all the glands of the body, and they will be affected by the motor system. Now, when the tract descends, then we have to see that how here we can see in the brain that there is an area called the motor cortex. Adjoining to it is the supplementary motor cortex, and adjoining to it is the premotor cortex. Now, these areas are largely responsible for the translation of the messages of the motor cortex and bringing them downwards via the descending tracts. Now, if we look at it further, we understand that the cerebral cortex has got both the ascending and the descending tracts. The ascending take the sensory information upwards, whereas the descending tracts carry them downwards. You can see in this diagram very well, and colors are here being used to depict the various tracts. That is the ascending and the descending, actually the areas of the cortex, not the tracts, areas of the cortex which begin from the tracts. If we move further, we can see that in the motor cortex, there is a premotor cortex and there is a supplementary motor cortex. Now, these areas are the part of the motor cortex which are lying in front of the central sulcus. We know sulci are depressions and gyri are the raised parts in the cortex. So, in the precentral gyrus is the primary motor cortex, and the premotor area and the supplementary motor area are in front of this precentral gyrus. So if we look at it, we find that the premotor cortex and the supplementary motor cortex, or the premotor area and the supplementary motor area, they are responsible for making up the plan which is going to be executed by the motor system with the help of the descending tracts, and will be functional at the muscles and at the glands. Now, there is a slight difference in the plans which are generated in the premotor area and the supplementary motor area, that the plans of the supplementary motor area are more primitive as compared to the premotor area. Okay, so now we move further and we see that the next part which is being taken up by the other part of the brain, let me share it with you. Now we come to the primary motor cortex, which is the area number 4. Now this primary motor cortex is lying on the precentral gyrus just in front of the central sulcus. Now this is responsible for execution of the movement. That is, the plans which were made by the supplementary and premotor areas are executed with the help of the primary motor cortex. Now this is a very, very important area, because here the excitation of the upper motor neurons is transferred to the lower parts of the brain spinal cord axis. Okay, and the lower motor neurons get activated and bring about the movement. Now let us have a close look at the motor cortex, which is depicting the motor homunculus. We all know the sensory homunculus, which is the representation of the sensory receptors in the different parts of our body on the brain. And here is a representation of the motor effectors of different parts of our body in the motor cortex or the motor homunculus. Here we can see that particularly the hand is very largely represented, the thumb out of which is enormous in size. The face has a huge representation. This tells us that the effector organ or the effector part of the motor system will not necessarily depend on the size, the actual size of the part in the body, same as the sensory system. Now, if we see a longitudinal section, we will roughly get an idea of how the descending tracts move down. You can very well see that at the top we have the this is the motor cortex, and in this motor cortex we can see that radiations, this type of radiations of the descending tract are coming, and these are known as the corona radiata. And when these corona radiata move down, we see here there is the thalamus, then here there is the internal capsule, and then here there is the lentiform nucleus. And where do these descending tracts come down from? From the internal capsule. Now, when these tracts descend, you can very well see that while descending, these tracts will come down in a straight pattern, and in the midbrain. In the midbrain, we all know that there is the superior colliculus, okay, and then followed by the superior colliculus, we have the substantia nigra, okay. And here we can see that from the crux cerebri here, from the crux cerebri, these fibers will come down in this fashion. Now, there is something very important, that at the level of the pons, this is the level of the pons, this is the level of the midbrain, and this is the level of the medulla. So, at the level of the pons, there is a large number of fibers which move to the cerebellum. That is, the motor fibers carry information to the cerebellum continuously, and the cerebellum continuously knows the actions which are going to happen. This is very important. And we all know that as it is, the cerebellum keep itself very, very well informed about the activities of the muscles, the tendons, the joints, and gives us a very good idea about our position, our stability, tone, posture, equilibrium. And that is why we tend to assume the most harmless or the safest position. Now, this is the medulla. Now, below the pons, there is the medulla, and from here, the medulla has got a very, very important structure. Here, there are pyramidal structures forming, and these pyramidal structures give the name to the tracts as the pyramidal tract. So, all the tracts passing through these pyramidal structures are known as the pyramidal tracts. And here is the site of the crossing over of the fibers. So, we know that almost all the fibers get crossed over. Only hardly 10% of the fibers will come down in a vertical manner. And when they come down in a vertical manner to the spinal cord, these fibers are straight and they form the anterior column. Whereas the fibers which get decussated move to the opposite side. They are 90% nearly, and these fibers are getting decussated. Okay, so we will get into details later on. First, let me move ahead and tell you about the next slide. Okay, so here again you can see a different section, horizontal sections supporting the coming down of the fibers. Now here you can very well see This you can see is the thalamus, the internal capsule. This is the lentiform nucleus. From here the fibers come down. Oh, sorry. From here the fibers come down, and when they come out, they move downwards. And when they move downwards, this is how they move in the lateral and in the anterior columns. Okay. So let us move further. Here we can see how the fibers attain the shape of a band of fibers, and how here in the mid pons they get descend. Then after the mid medulla they cross over. Mostly 90% of the fibers are crossing over to the opposite side lateral column, whereas only 10% are coming down as anterior column on the same side. So this can be clearly evident from so many diagrams. Again, I have put a diagram. You can see right from the beginning, the area 4, which programs the plans of the motor system. Here it is coming down. You can see from here it starts. Here, this is the internal capsule. It comes down. From here, most of the fibers, they get crossed, decussation at the level of the pyramids in the medulla, and coming to the opposite side, and then they affect the distal muscles, etc. Now, let me tell you what these descending tracts are actually. Now, the tracts are basically divided into the pyramidal system and the extra-pyramidal system. As the name suggests, those which are descending via the pyramidal system, they are under the pyramidal tracts, and those which are beyond or outside the pyramidal system, they are the extra-pyramidal system. Okay, so now we all have seen in the ascending tracts also that the nomenclature, the naming of the tracts has been done in a very, very good manner. The site of origin and insertion forms the name of the tract. Say, for example, the corticospinal tract has got a lateral and a ventral corticospinal tract. The corticobulbar tract. Similarly, we have the extrapyramidal system also. We will be detailing about it later on. Now, as I move further, I would like to tell you about the corticospinal tracts or the pyramidal tracts. Now, if we look at it in details, now go back to your first diagram and just have a look. The site of origin of these corticospinal, cortico from the cortex, here the motor cortex, spinal reaching the spinal cord. 30% from primary motor areas, that are the area number 4 and 6. We saw supplementary and premotor areas again 30%, and primary somatosensory cortex 40%. Now, how do they move downwards? This is a very, very clean and clear diagram. So here you can see clearly this is the motor cortex. These are the corona radiata. Now, these descending fibers come down via the corona radiata. In the internal capsule, they converge and they come down and occupy. Let us leave so much of details. Let us bring them down. And here we see that midbrain, then pons, then medulla. Okay, so we see that here in the midbrain, they come down. In the pons, they get more compact, they come closer to each other because of the closer spacing out. And here in the medulla, they form the pyramids. They form the pyramids here in the medulla. The pyramidal structures are triangular structures. And here it says that 80% of the fibers will cross and 20% will remain uncrossed. Okay, so synapses, the ones which get crossed, they would synapse with the anterior horn cells of the spinal cord, and the uncrossed would not. So again, you can have a look. See, this is the way the pyramid is formed, basically by the way, the spread out manner in which the pyramid or the fibers go ahead. Now, if we come further and we understand the upper motor neuron and the lower motor neuron. So this is a slide which is showing the paralysis. The basic idea is that the injury to the upper motor and motor areas can be seen. Now let us have a closer look. Again, you can see. So they are showing that if at this point there is an injury to the upper motor neuron. So the upper motor neuron is connecting the part of the brain to the spinal cord, and the lower motor neuron is connecting the part of the spinal cord. Let me shift this. Let me try to shift this if I can. Yeah. So now you can see that the lower motor neuron is the part of the is the neuron which is connecting the spinal cord to the effector organ, which is going to be the gland or the muscle, and the upper motor neuron is connecting the brain to the spinal cord. Okay, so now let us come to the next slide. Let me tell you the functions of the pyramidal tracts. Okay, so now we come to the lateral corticospinal tracts. Lateral, as you know, were the ones which got crossed over, the 80% ones at the level of the medulla, and which are coming down at the opposite side. They are the lateral corticospinal tracts. They are controlling the voluntary movements, means the movements which work as per our will. So these voluntary movements are the fine movements of the fingers. So skilled working, embroidery, painting, using your fingers, how you train them, this is all controlled by the lateral corticospinal tract. And remember the motor homunculus. It has got a huge representation of the hand and the largest of the thumb. Now, this function is control of muscle of. Now the second tract is the, this was about the lateral corticospinal tract. After the lateral corticospinal tract is the anterior corticospinal tract, which are only 10 to 20% of the descending fibers. Now they are controlling the muscles of the trunk and the proximal part of the limb, that is for postural adjustments and gross movements, how we move, how we tone up our trunk. Athletes have got a very good development of the anterior corticospinal tract. This is significant. Okay, so if we move on to the next slide, let me bring this down a little. We will be able to see that they form a part of the pathways for superficial reflexes such as the cremasteric reflex. Just let me get back to it. Just a second. I would like to go back to it. Now, these were the functions of the pyramidal tracts. And when I move ahead, we see that the pyramidal tracts form a part of the pathway for superficial reflexes. We all know that reflex has got a sensory segment, a center, and a motor segment. So this is forming the motor segment of reflexes like the cremasteric, abdominal, and plantar reflexes. And we saw that they are effective in the trunk and extremities muscles. Now, some of the fibers of the corticospinal tracts, they end on few neurons which may excite or inhibit the alpha motor neurons. Now, what does this mean? Some of these fibers may either be excitatory or may be inhibitory. Some of these fibers transmit information from the brain to the afferent neurons. Afferent, which take the information towards the brain, and so can affect the afferent system as well. Okay, and how do they do it? They terminate on the afferent system. So the motor responses which are coming down may also affect the afferent responses or the information going upwards. Okay, now the corticospinal fibers arising from somatic sensory area, that is the area 1 and 2, and parietal lobe association cortex. These fibers are associated with sensory and motor coordination. Essentially, we saw the ascending tracts and we are studying the motor tracts. Now, this is very important that whatever goes up as a sensation is responsible for whatever is coming down as a motor effect. So, there has to be some coordination between the two. And here we learn that this is controlled by the corticospinal fibers which are arising in the somatic sensory area 1 and 2 and the parietal lobe. So they are kind of connectors between the sensory cortex and the motor cortex. Now, suppose I want somebody to put the tip of the finger on the nose, hand-eye coordination, okay, hand movement coordination. So something has affected. Suppose I have to show from where the fire is coming. So I can see it with my eye. It is a sensation, and I will point it with my finger. That is a motor effect. So both of these have to be related, and this sensory motor coordination is done in the brain. And if this sensory motor coordination is not there, then the person's performance is very poor. Normally, the absence or the uh, reduced sensory motor coordination results in delayed responses. And I've written an example of the knife and fork. How do you cut with the knife, insert the fork, and then you eat with it? So that is a very good classical example of a sensory motor coordination. Now we come to the second functions, that is the corticobulbar. Okay, the corticobulbars were the second type of pyramidal tract. Now these corticobulbar or corticonuclear tracts, these are responsible for the voluntary control of muscles of the larynx, that is the voice box, the pharynx, the palate, upper and lower jaw, eye, face, etc. Now, if this function is not executed properly, then there is either paralysis or weakness of muscles which are affecting functions like swallowing, talking, tongue and lip movements due to bilateral lesions of these tracts. Now, we can see very clearly that the corticobulbar or the corticonuclear tracts are controlling some very, very important features. And if any of these features is reduced or affected, then the performance of the person is grossly affected. And so this is the very, very important and very, very crucial tract, the pyramidal tract of the second type, which is the corticobulbar or the corticonuclear. Coming to the extrapyramidal system. Now, we know what are the extrapyramidal system. They are part of the motor system. They are the descending tracts. Now, these are the ones besides the pyramidal tracts, and also the ones which are not reaching the cerebellar system. So the ones which are originating in the motor cortex, not a part of the pyramidal system and not reaching the cerebellar system, are the extrapyramidal tracts. And these are largely responsible for our muscular movements and our posture. Now, it is written that its fibers have many synapses in their descending path, with cells of the nuclear masses on the way, which include. Now, this is showing that extrapyramidal tract, in the pyramidal tract, we saw only two neurons. Okay, whereas in the extrapyramidal tract we can see a lot of synapses are being formed, that is many more neurons are functional in the extrapyramidal tract, and many more centers of the brain are getting involved in the execution of the extrapyramidal activity, which is largely the activity of the muscles and the posture. Okay, so we can see that in the spinal cords they separate according to their site of origin, and we will read it by their names, that different extrapyramidal tracts originating in different parts of the brain will get separated into finer bundles and perform their individual activity. Say for examples, rubrospinal, all reaching the spinum but originating at different positions. Vestibulospinal, reticulospinal, tectospinal. We will be going into details later on. So these motor pathways, unlike the pyramidal system, are more complex, multisynaptic, and largely responsible for muscular activity, gross muscular activity. So here, axial muscles that maintain balance and posture. Axial muscles are muscles of the center of the body, which form the axis of the body. The muscles of the limbs, the muscles of the trunk. Muscles controlling coarse movement of proximal portions of limbs. The head, neck, and eye movement. So we can see they are very, very important part of the motor execution system in our body. Now here a diagrammatic representation has been done on how the origin of these extrapyramidal tracts occurs. And you can see that this origin is very, very clear in different areas of the brain. So as the name suggests, they originate in different parts and they get down at smaller distances. They form new synapses, you can see. A lot of neurons involved. Okay, but this is the cerebellar part, so this is not the extrapyramidal system, whereas this is. Okay, so moving further, now if I name a few of the extrapyramidal system tracts, they are the rubrospinal, the tectospinal, the vestibulospinal, the reticulospinal, and the olivospinal tracts. And before I go into details of these tracts, I would like to tell you that all of these tracts are responsible for specific function which is being controlled by the site of their origin.